Wow. Man, today's conversations have been very biological.
Yeah.
That's something that I think that's an instant pattern for me. Blake, let's just dive in. I mean,
Let's dive in.
this is the best way to start a conversation after having a conversation about Jewish versus Indian cultures. So I want to start off, because the way we met is through my cousin. Again, cousin, brother, same thing. uh, Sid, and he was at SF for an event, and you were there too, and you guys hit it off, and he was like, you are very similar to this guy called Sarthak, and you guys should like definitely meet. Said the
Yeah.
same thing to me, you are very similar to Blake, you guys should meet. And then we talked, and it was a great conversation, and I think what he found to be similar there is our curiosity and also drive to connect people together, just be a connector. And that's something that I got instantly from you, is like you're very passionate about communities and building these communities. So, if someone doesn't know you, what is it that you tell them about your story to understand why you do what you do?
So first of all, let's define why I do what I do. I do what I do because I believe we're all very similar. I think there are demarcations, differentiations that we try to make, whether it's political belief, religious belief, whatever these areas are, but we're very similar. That is a more surface, layer one that tries to differentiate people versus on the more layer two, layer three, we're very similar. I mean, we all have families to take care of. We all need to eat. I mean, from like even Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we all need to eat, we all need to sleep, we all need to
Can
do.
you explain just briefly about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just for someone that doesn't know?
My basic understanding is we have a basic level of needs, which are eating and sleeping and just basic functionality. And then imagine it as a pyramid. So that's the base. And then as you continue to progress in height, then really at the top is more of, once all those needs are taken care of, then you can actually have more of like art and self-expression, self-actualization, things that are like philosophical conversations. We can have a philosophical conversation all day, but if I'm starving, I don't want to have a philosophical conversation. I could care less. Like, give me the tuna can.
I was just talking to the last podcast before last I recorded was with this guy who came in as an undocumented citizen to the US, and he got his green card a few years later. His parents did not have any, obviously they were also undocumented, and he came in when he was 7 years old. And like every day, first of all, one is like the stigma around being undocumented is you don't want to interact with too many people that know that you are not a citizen or you're here illegally, right? But the other thing is like the situation that you're in as a result of that. They just came in, pretty much to find a better life, but it was a big struggle for them financially. So this guy had like, when he was 9, 10 years old, had started like already working with, repairing iPhones had just come out, and he had learned a little bit about how to repair a screen because he broke his own iPhone that he somehow got after collecting whatever savings, and so he started helping others like repair iPhones. In that moment, now he's an ophthalmologist. He does space medicine. He's specifically working on stuff around how does our body change in space and how can you provide for therapies there. But I asked him this question: is like when you were, at these ages, like the teens, and you're again finding food and tuna cans to survive, can you have this conversation of what is my purpose and what is it that I want to do? So what are your thoughts on this? Like, do you think that when you're in that level on the hierarchy of needs, where you're thinking about food, shelter, air, basics, does everyone, I guess the question is, does everyone have a purpose?
So I think when you're at that stage, these questions really, they can come up, but there's such a small amount of weight placed on them because if you and your family need to sleep and eat and make sure that your basic needs are taken care of, like these bigger questions, it really is a luxury to think of these questions. It's a real luxury to be able to have time and space to think of these questions. What makes me happy? What makes what's my purpose? What direction am I heading in? I think with the advances of technology in the past, few hundred years, we've had the opportunity to really think about these questions now really in depth. Not that they haven't beforehand, they haven't had the opportunity beforehand, but now we do have much more ample opportunity to have time and space to think about this versus beforehand, things were much less inefficient. They didn't have the tools that they need. So I think it's very helpful for each person to know, or at least have a belief system as to what their purpose is. So then their actions can be guided more directly. I've found a lot of people, even younger students in college, that are they're like, I just don't know, myself included when I was early in college. It's like, I don't know why I'm doing the things that I'm doing.
What were you doing?
In college specifically, a lot. I mean, it was a branch of, I was working on a nonprofit. I was building relationships between the Black and Jewish communities. That helps answer the question that you originally asked, which is that we're very similar, scrape across whatever the surface level, differences are. That's one thing that I was doing. I was leading recruitment for an entrepreneurship fraternity. It was, I was on the rowing team my senior year. I was doing a lot of stuff just to like figure out, try things, experiment, meet new people. But I think to answer that question, I think it's important for people to at least try to attempt to answer that question, even if they don't know, because then you at least know what future direction you're heading towards, and you feel as if the actions you're taking are leading to that, purpose, whatever that defined purpose is. So hopefully everyone has the opportunity to, but a good chunk of the world has no interest in doing so because they need to address their initial Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They need to make sure everything's taken care of. If it's not, who cares about what your purpose is?
When you just discussed what you were doing in college, I mean, this is undergrad, I'm guessing, right?
That's not great.
So, I mean, it seems like you had a natural drive. I mean, it seems like you're pretty driven because not everyone does everything during undergrad. I mean, at that time, you're just sort of, a lot of people tend to be pretty relaxed, and I mean, they're either only focusing on academics, and so they're going in that direction, but they're not putting their 90%, 95% of people aren't putting their efforts into doing all these other things, nonprofit work and community work and stuff. Where does that come from? Like, can you like take yourself back to a point where you kind of notice that you just want to? Where does the drive come from?
I mean, it's broken down. Probably some of it is environmental, what I grew up in culturally. Some of it's genetic, and then some of it's based on experiences and inspiration. So I think environmentally, I mean, my dad is a very, very just motivated person. He just does. He's a radiologist full time, and he's also working on his first movie, in his off time. That's just what he does. So he's always working on projects, and I see that, live, that he's always doing different projects, different things. So that environmentally I get inspiration from, and then also that is genetic since it's passed down from him, my mom also. And then inspiration wise, I think I realized at a very early age, I worked in hospice care when I was 17, and working in hospice care, it's not for everyone. I would not recommend it for everyone. However, it was a unique opportunity to be exposed to. And just give me 1 second. I'm just going to make sure he's all good. Okay. So when I was in hospice care, you see what is important and you see what's not important very quickly, because I had a patient once who, he was very sick, very, very sick. I mean, most of the patients in hospice care are very sick. And they have very little time to, before their phase ends. And it was very sad to see that he had literally no family members at his side. He just was there for days on end. And I think it was a very good reminder of like, okay, you got to do stuff. You got to do stuff that hopefully is aligned with purpose. So, keep doing good deeds, keep being a good person. It's not just about what I thought what life was about when I was 17. It's, there are important things in life to do. And, I think that's definitely a good part of the fuel is life's very, very short. It can go like that. It's very short. And so finding ways to make sure that you make the most out of it. So I think that was a good drive. I think I had a nice perspective, thankfully.
So, I mean, that's a very unique experience. 17 years of age, you're in a hospice environment. I'll give you a story here. When I was maybe 13 or 14, my dad had a few years before that started a company. He'd been in like mobile connectivity and like telecom for a while, and he was like, there's a lot to be done in connecting the rural parts of India that at that time did not have access to a lot of this internet and all that. So he ended up building this hardware company that deploys hotspot zones in very rural parts, tier 3 cities, villages in India. And when I was 13, one of the summers that I had off after school, I ended up going with for that summer with him to these villages. And that's where I got now that I look back, is like my understanding of levels of hardship that people have, because they're just, again, focused on having a house to live in. They were barely scratching the surface on like having connectivity like to the world. So it's like you're in this, in some ways, in your own echo chamber of the village that you're in, and you don't care too much about what's happening outside. But it showed me like, okay, there's so much that we can do if we're in a relatively privileged place to make sure that we can advance like our knowledge, or some ways like our value out to the world. Do you recognize or remember any event or experience, particularly with your dad, that kind of showed you like this drive that you talk about that he has, like from childhood? Anything you did together, or anything you just observed?
I think he was my baseball coach. That was in his off time. But he wasn't just my baseball coach. He was him and I are very similar in this way. When we want to do something, we're gonna really do something. He's gonna study as many of the baseball coaching books, and he played baseball too. He's gonna study as many of the baseball coaching books as possible. He's gonna become very good, because that's he may not know a lot about it, but he's gonna learn very quickly. And we were thankful. We were a good team. We definitely were a good baseball team. We were good. We were good thanks to him and a few other players. But I think it's because he has this inclination to just, when he sets his mind on something, he's going to learn it ultra fast and execute very well. I'm not placing myself in his category. I think he's significantly better in that, but I think I at least get small sparks of inspiration from that, because I see it. He does that and he's done that with dozens and dozens of micro projects. So I think baseball was a big influence. Seeing him as my coach, seeing how he quickly learned, seeing how successful he was in that in depth.
Yeah. Is there a piece of advice that he's given you that has really stood out to you, that like kind of you've applied consistently in your life?
That's such a good question, because there's so many pieces. What piece can I choose? I'll just think of what comes to mind now, which is just try to be as fair and logical in your decision making process as possible. I think I'm naturally more emotional, just who I
Hmm.
am. I'm more of a sensitive person. I'm more emotional. It's definitely one of my strengths, though. And for him, he still is very keen on make sure, with key decisions that you're making, make sure you break them down, really, really sift through them. Because as a radiologist, he has to be so fact based. There's no emotion. There's really no emotional component to that field of work, because he's basically breaking down, does this person have cancer or not? I can't add my emotional input. This is the fact. This is not the fact. I don't necessarily live my life. I don't operate to that extent, but I do think it's a good practice to learn from. Still being as level-headed as possible, so you're not so off the grounds. And then that's what he said. But then in action, it's more of just do more. Just do, but not in a pressure-filled way. He's just do more. I mean, he just does. He just
Hmm.
does it. He's very humble, does not talk about it. And there's a Jewish, I'm gonna paraphrase it, but there's like a Jewish phrase, I think in Pirkei Avos. It just says like, just do more and say less. I'm
Hmm.
paraphrasing it. It doesn't specifically say that, but the principle is just say less. Say less, once it's done, maybe talk about it.
Maybe whispered in someone's ear.
Maybe put it in a little letter and open it 10 years later.
Man, and the thing is, like, I think you're in when it comes to parents, it's very the advice is almost always coming from a place of observation of things that we are maybe not doing, right? Or like we should be doing. So it's like advice comes because there is something that is not being done right in some ways, but the way that it's said is so interesting because I remember even when I was in school, like I didn't have like a I used to love a lot of things, and I think yeah, I had a lot of interests, but I wouldn't fully pursue any of those interests. It would sort of be everything haphazardly done. And so I remember my dad every day, I'm not even kidding, every single day, somehow in some conversation, he would say, "Work hard, not hardly." That's his thing. I just remember that. Work hard, not hardly. And now every time I'm thinking about not doing something, I think of that. Work hard, not hardly.
I also think I think Warren Buffett said, if there are 20 things on your to do or priority list, write down all 20 and then scratch out 19 and you're just going to focus on the top one. Everything. Now, that's hard. I think the Latin root of the word decide means to cut. And
Mm.
that's hard to cut, especially when you have I completely relate to this. I had so many and I still have so many interests. You can see books. I have a lot of things that I'm interested in. And so to hyper focus on one thing is hard, but it's extremely relieving once you have locked in, at least for a set period of time in hours. This is what I'm doing.
Why is it hard?
Because there's so much to learn. There's so much to do. There's so much you and I are both curious people. There's so much to learn. I think the world is so that all the knowledge is connected. What you learn in biology is connected to what a tech person can incorporate in a product development lifecycle, which could relate to IFS family therapy. It's so connected. And that's something that I think infinitely fascinating, that I'll continue to find fascinating, is just how all these, my style of thinking is associative. I think by associative thinking, where it's, one concept, how does that connect to the next concept, which is seemingly completely unrelated and unconnected? How does biology relate to business, which relates to A, B, and C topic? And that's why I think it's so hard, at least for me, because I see that they're not completely separate from each other, and they're all helpful in different ways, whether it's a conversation, whether it's in research and in development, whatever that is. That's why I think it's hard. It's interesting.
I hope that through this conversation we can get some connections. I think that would be an amazing way to bring this podcast together is that we're able to connect things that we haven't been able to connect before. But something that we talked about last time was about how you see similarities in you play tennis, I play tennis. How you see similarities between tennis as a sport and business.
Yeah.
Can you talk
Yes.
about that?
Yes. So 2 nights ago, I'm in Las Vegas right now. 2 nights ago, I went to the place that I played tennis at in high school. There's a little clinic running, and the instructor he was from Chile. I loved his style. I'll tell you his style. Basically, there are four guys, two guys on one side, five guys, two guys on one side, three guys on the other side. And this instructor, no filter, completely gave it to everyone when that person was messing up. Your feet aren't there. You're in no man's land. You're playing awfully. You need to fix it. Most people would not resonate with that because that's too off putting. That is real time feedback that is brutal, but is so important for that person to learn and adjust. I think, especially in American culture generally, I don't want to overgeneralize, but what I've seen in small pockets of American culture, there's a tendency not to be as direct. There's usually a tendency to be a little bit more indirect in terms of improvement. You don't want to hurt people's feelings. They're sensitive. Culturally, what's happening, and you don't want to be canceled, all these things. You want to be politically correct. The consequence of that is sometimes you don't get the real time information that you need to improve and adjust, especially from a business level setting. So when I see someone like that giving real time feedback, he was not PC, and I wouldn't advocate for how his style of not being PC, but his directness is so helpful from an improvement standpoint, because then he called him Goose. His name was Goose that he was critiquing. Goose, you're not doing this, Goose. When Goose would come back, I think his name's Gus. I think that was his accent. When Gus would come
What
back,
a silly goose, man.
Silly Goose, yeah. He improved
Yeah.
significantly. He improved. He got to the net. His footing was adjusted, and he wasn't in no man's land. And then he won points because of that, because he got direct feedback that was harsh, which is all of us are looking around thinking, I can't believe he just said that. But that's helpful. So there's so many parallels. I mean, I can go. That's just what immediately comes to mind. There's so many parallels. What do you see? What do you see the parallels are?
I mean, the most, especially if someone is starting something and is like solo in that project, in that company, whatever that endeavor is. Tennis, when it comes to one on one, is like just the best learning trajectory for understanding yourself and how you deal with how you because again it's feedback. You give yourself feedback every time you do something wrong on the court, and you see how you talk to yourself internally when you don't hit the shot the way you want to, when you don't hit the serve the way you want to, when you do something really well, and what you think about yourself in those moments. So I feel like there is such a clear correlation between the emotions I put out on the tennis court and how I deal with myself, and how I would deal with myself if I'm doing a project by myself, and I'm involving other people in it, and I'm working with other people, because it shows me where my limits lie in the way that I am emotionally capable of understanding. And I think when you think about the greats in any sport, but tennis, for example, when you already have kind of nailed down the skill to like that level where you're already like in the top 10 in the world, like after that it's not the skill per se that you see on the court, but it's what's happening here, right? What's happening here is what I think that has the biggest correlation and application to everything else in my life.
But you do have to reach a certain skill level.
Yes.
You could have the best mentality and mindset ever, but you just may not have the capabilities. Yeah, there are at least a threshold that you really have to get to. But I agree. We played competitively in high school, very very competitively, and these people were pretty evenly balanced skill set wise. Pretty much like it could go any way, and I think that was an advantage of me, and I should definitely do a better job. Which was, I was very calm. It would just be, ball didn't go where I wanted it to. I'm not. I learned from it because I used to do this. I'm not going to slam my racket on the fence. I'm just going to and that took a lot of work. It took a lot of work, which is initially it was, I can't believe this didn't go my way. It's how you get mad and you throw a tennis ball. And then the adjustment was, well, that's not going to help. That's just a waste of energy. That's just a waste of energy. That's actually counterproductive. And the opponent knows that they're winning mentally. I know when an opponent on the other side has like broken and started to complain and scream and curse. I know deep down I'm like, it's game. I know they've already lost, because they've told themselves that they've lost and they're communicating it. So I think having almost like a non-reactivity, but also a non-reactivity when it's game time, but then stepping outside and then being hyper receptive to feedback that you're noticing yourself. Because it really, if you're a singles tennis player, you notice these small things that it's on you. I think with any single related sport, it's on you to improve or not, and you'll know whether you're not improving, because you're going to lose, and you're going to lose relatively bad if you don't improve. So I think actually one difference is sometimes in the business world, there's actually not as much as that of that real time feedback
Hmm.
in what you do.
Hmm.
From my experience, my very limited experience in that area, which is, there's not as much real time feedback, which I think is very helpful. I think there's a book that by I think his name is Anders. I think it's called Peak Performance. I think I need to find the title of it, but basically it talks about how high performing athletes, how they do it, what they do, what their mechanisms are. And one of the mechanisms is consistent real time feedback to improve. For example, you're running, you get your pace. Your running says if you're running a mile, you're at 9 minutes pace. That means I know exactly, how far and how long I'm going and what's my cadence, how many steps am I taking. These are things that I can 100% improve. And I think that's now the similarity of this business world is that's why people try to do metrics. That's why they try to do KPIs so they can at least see how they can improve. Because if you can't measure, it's so hard to improve what is not measured. And I mean, that's something I need to do a better job at is measuring, the importance of measuring, but not just measuring to measure so you can communicate how good you did through. It's not just measuring to measure. It's measuring because that's aligned with the purpose, with the goal. It needs to be aligned with the purpose. Otherwise, why are you measuring stuff? You need to measure stuff so you can get to that goal better in a better way, in a faster way.
When it comes to business, what is your goal?
It depends on the business. Are you saying specifically for, the goal the fiduciary duty of a business is to make, if you have a public company, is to make profits for the shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
And then the alternative is to, solve a challenge. So that's what I really find interesting about, business. That's my take on it, is just, it's problem solving. It's real-time problem solving. And then the market, if it finds it valuable, then it will pay for that problem that you have solved for. So I mean the function of the business is to generate revenue if you're for profit. The nonprofit side, which I typically find, it's just, I've been in both worlds. Both are interesting. Both are different models. Both have different, pros and cons to them. The nonprofit tends to be, less of a better revenue model, but there's definitely more of a mission focus of, we're not just here for generating revenue. We're here for solving a real problem that's affecting, the X community with their specific problems. So I mean, that's what I see business really helping in that capacity, is it's solving problems, and then they make revenue and profit from solving those problems.
In your experience with nonprofit and for profits, I mean, now but let's talk about transferable things, because I think there's a lot of value in, again, connecting ideas that are not seemingly connected. But this is a clear one thing that like a for profit could get from a nonprofit is having a more mission oriented nature in building stuff. What is something you see in the for profit that can be done and applied to the nonprofit world?
I'll tell you right now, since that's what I'm dealing with in the moment. I think just being significantly more innovative in the way, being just much more innovative. For example, one of my closest friends, he lives in San Francisco. He worked at Google, and now he's building a company, and he's so in that loop, that little bubble. I mean, in Austin, but that little bubble of everyone's talking AI and
Yeah,
technology.
yeah.
I'd say a very large chunk of nonprofits are, they have their ways, pretty traditional, takes time, and maybe they'll have one or two new things. I think the innovative side is, well, why aren't you using the newest version of, my friend and I are playing around, we're learning, I can tell you about it, but we're playing around with Gemini to learn how does Google's Gemini work better? How can we make things 10 times more efficient? How can we apply that to the processes that we have? I think that type of thinking isn't as common in the nonprofit space. I think that like fast moving forward thinking to be at the best level, because there are other people competing in the space. I think that type of thinking can be applied much more. Just this innovative hustle type of culture. Yeah.
Well, what is why do you think that's not the case in a nonprofit?
I think, again, this is just, it's from a very limited perspective of only being exposed to a few, but typically people within the nonprofit space are super mission aligned, but they're not that many business oriented people. Like the ones who are the business oriented and the tech oriented people, they're working for profit companies, since that typically has the higher, financial reward, which makes sense. So I think there's a trade-off of working with, so the people within that nonprofit space typically are more, they care about it a lot. They really care about it, but they may not have as much of the executional ability relative to some of the people in the for-profit space, because I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying that's a small thing that I've just noticed. It's like the talent typically goes more towards for-profit, and there's a micro percentage of people that go to the nonprofit. And typically those people come after they've already made their careers.
Yeah, that goes back to our path in just overall life. It feels like it's just this mindset, right? That we need to. Nawal Ravikant talks about this too. Like first to get rich, and then think about philosophy and think about what it is that you actually want to do. And this is the trajectory of older people post economic talking about and moving into these roles and wanting to help in that time. What are your thoughts on that? Like, is that a trajectory? Since you're already working with nonprofits, seems like that's not what you kind of abide by.
It's tricky. It's tricky because post college, you have realizations where it's like, okay, we have bills, we have like real bills to pay, make sure everything's taken care of, and so there's much less time to have these types of conversations. But it is, for me, it's so hard for me not to work on things that are what I think are important. It's hard. It's very hard for me to just, you know, be a number in the company. I can, and I'm able to do it, and I'm able to do it well. I think there's just more of an inclination to want to do some things that I think are important, and that is where that nonprofit side comes in. And I have noticed a trend where a lot of college students that I've mentioned are like, I want to work, and I even think like culturally with our generation, they want to work on things that are more meaningful, things that are more relative to what they care about. And so I do think the for-profit side could totally learn from the nonprofit side from an employee retention standpoint,
Hmm.
which is a lot of these employees, they don't just want to work, you know, with things that have no meaning. That's why I think you're seeing a lot of these community service things that are being implemented in some of these community or in these companies, some of these like more mentorship programs, some of these opportunities for these people to be much more mission. That's why some of these B Corps I think are starting to get more of a rise where it's more for-profit and nonprofit model. Because people still want to feel as if they're still doing meaningful work. And in America, typically work is your primary identity. That's a whole nother topic. And thankfully that's not the case. I don't think that's the case for me, but that is a product of this culture, which is, your work you spend so much time in. So you want it to be meaningful. So the for-profit side can definitely learn from the nonprofit side because that typically adds more meaning, but the for-profit side typically adds more funds and revenue,
Mm.
which are typically within that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like if you have kids, family, school doesn't pay for itself in some areas.
Yeah, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the work side of things. How do you navigate? You tend to go to events, tend to go out there, put yourself out there. How does one navigate these conversations of what do you do? And when it's all focused on work, what is something that you have tried doing to connect better with people?
There was a phase in my life where I irked when that was the first question that people asked, what do you do? It's like, you don't know me. Why are you asking that? Now I'm like, I understand. I understand why people are asking that. I mean, everyone's got their own objectives, their own missions. And if you're not relevant within the first, 10 seconds, it doesn't really make sense. That's one mentality to have. Still, I don't feel like it's a good way to connect. I think it's not the best. It's not one of the better ways. I think a few things. I think one thing is, asking questions that are atypical and that are actually relevant and meaningful for their life without being too deep. There's a tendency for like some people, they'll like go straight into like, what's your entire everything? It's like, dude, exhausted. I don't want to talk about everything, and I don't know you, so
Yeah.
I'm not going to. So there are ways to do it where it's not so deep, but it's still open-ended. So for a few examples would be like, what's taking up 80% of your mental real estate right now? What are you thinking about primarily? And then we cut across into like exactly what's going on in their life. And then it's more improvisational, which is, okay, now like just what you're doing. Now we're taking from specific moments that they're bringing in and we're diving in as if we've known each other for
Mm.
much longer than we really have. And I think that makes it much more natural. That's what I prefer because then you're talking about what you care about and I'm interested in what you care about, vice versa. I don't want to talk about the weather. I don't want to talk about how you're doing. Obviously, I'd care how you're doing and feeling, but these things take up 5 to 10 minutes of time. How are you doing? How are the that's different. There's different types of catching up too. With someone who's brand new, I like to go in and really understand like what they're thinking about. So like I connect, and see if there's probably an area of connection that I'm like, oh yeah, I've thought about that before, or let's jam on that. I think like having the intent to want to find similarity first, I think is really, really helpful to just start having like meaningful discussion. Because
Connection points.
yeah, definitely connection points, but real connection points, things that you have like genuinely care about and are excited to talk about. Because people can smell when you're just like, oh yeah, I've read that
Mm.
book you just know the title, and you can. It has to be an authentic level of connection.
So I got two questions here. First, let's start off with books. What is a book that has deeply impacted you in the last year?
Let's see. I think there's two. There's two. One, maybe the business book. The business book, which has been really helpful. I would say Bob Berg is great. I would say Endless Referrals.
Whoa.
Really good.
Okay.
Really helpful. This could be great for your podcast too. And I think one of the bigger takeaways from this book was, really having the intent to ask people like, who are you looking to meet relative to what you're doing with
Mm.
this possible for people to meet, and can I put you in touch with them with no intention other than just like, I may know someone, I'm happy to put you in touch. And I think that's a mentality that I have just been testing in this past year, and it's been great. I'm not expecting anything. It's just cool. If I can put this person in touch with that person, and they're both aligned, great. If I get a picture of them together, even better. And so I think that book was really helpful. And then actually, I'll just answer with one book for now. That was just more on the business side.
And I saw there's a bunch of notes there. Can you show the book again?
Yes. This one is definitely stickered.
So, what is like, have you maybe not developed a process, but what is it that you're writing in these notes? Give an example. So, the reason I ask this question is that I think reading books is also a level of status seeking when it comes to number of books that you've read and being looked at as a well read person. But I think the way you seem to be navigating this, like coming up with your idea of what you got out of it by writing some stuff down, it would be very helpful for people to understand, like, what is a way that you take notes?
I think business books typically communicate what they need to communicate in maybe 5 or 10 pages out of a 200-page book.
Hmm.
And they're not nonfiction. They're not a deep novel. They're not, there for stylistic elements. They're there to communicate a few key points, and then really it's a marketing tool for them, for you to sign up for whatever they're doing. So with business books, I'll take a very quick skim. I'll just tell you what I did for this, not for everyone, but for this one. I took a quick skim to see, what this book is about. Really, like each chapter, is this interesting? Is this relevant? And then I would just quickly underline anything that I thought was like worth zooming in. And then that would be my first run. That would take not that long. The second run would then be, okay, let's take a look at the underlines, see if there's actually something there. And then now add a sticky note to that underline if it's actually something that's relevant. Then ideally you go through it again and then find, those out of those sticky notes, what are the most relevant sticky notes, and then applying them. I mean, you have to apply them immediately. Otherwise, it's you're
In your
reading
head.
just to read. You have to apply. You have to apply those principles that you're learning. Otherwise, you feel like you're productive, but it's really a fake sense of productivity. You're not being that
Just
productive.
like watching a
Just watching.
podcast like
Right,
this one
right,
and
right.
not doing anything about it.
Right. If there's something that you can take away, review it. There's a called chazara in Hebrew, which is to review, review, review. Every time you review, I used to be repelled by the concept of reviewing, especially with homework and notes. But now I'm such a big believer in reviewing, but not just to review, just to like memorize the same stuff. Like reviewing by looking at it, like reviewing, really like reviewing, really seeing it differently. What did I see initially to where I didn't catch the first time? Okay. Now even the second time I didn't catch up on that. How is that different here? Like really relearning it every time. So that's what I would say. Quick skim, underline, sticky note, and because this definitely worked out, this process worked out well for me, and then apply, and then revisit after a period of time. I mean, I don't have as much of a formal process there, but like spaced repetition is really helpful. After maybe in 2 months, I'll read this again, really see what sticks out, what works, what didn't work.
That's helpful because I find it really hard to review a lot of these things.
Yeah, why is
It's
that?
there's a level of urgency. I don't know. There's a level of urgency with which I am doing anything at this point. It's like this thing of like, okay, read a book, cool. Found something, do it, apply it. But then that's it. Like there's no point to like go back to it. Just you found something, take it, move on. Next thing. Working on something, do it. Just like there's like a very monotonous and like mechanical way with which I'm doing things. And I think it comes from this level of urgency I feel to get to the next thing.
Right.
And I think that is a the underlying thing for me at least is this ability to or wanting to prove myself that I can uh, be very action oriented because early on I was not when I was a kid, and it's like, hey, I can like do more things now. And my whole college experience, I'm in a part-time program at UT Austin, has been about like doing as many, like similar to your undergrad things, like just doing as many projects and things I can do within a year's period. And it comes from the same thing. It's like, okay, I have a year, at least the program gives me the urgency because I have only this much time. So I'm like, okay, I have a year, let me this it's applied to me rather than me just having to think of a random timeline, do something in this timeline and get these projects out there.
I completely relate to that, where it's just, and sometimes it's a false sense of urgency. The need to feel productive. Why do you need to feel so? It's actually a false sense of productivity. It's just being busy. But and it's uncomfortable to spend like significant amount of time with something, whether it's a book or
Hmm.
whatever it is, because that again goes back to the word decide. That means to cut, which means everything else that you want to do and learn, you cannot do.
Okay, I don't know how it is for you, but I was having this conversation recently with a friend, and I was telling him, like, I am really good. Like, one of my super skills, I think, is that I can justify anything I'm doing to somehow fit into the larger thing that I want to be doing.
Yeah.
Does that relate at all?
Yeah, totally.
I can give myself like I can do like a side project in like an example, literally like true example. In summer, I did the side project with a professor that has developed a technology very early stage on taking air, like atmospheric air, and converting it into clean water. Okay, I'm like, whoa, okay, this could apply to some random shit that in the world, like you could, where water is scarce and all that stuff and clean water is scarce. And I'm like, okay, I should continue doing this for the next, like, the whole year. And it was one of the projects that we had to choose a project that we want to take for the whole year. But after the summer I realized, like, this does not fit at all into the things that I think I can contribute to. But in that moment, I clearly justified it to myself, like, hey, this can be super helpful because I want to help in some way, in the health, and the health is a big part of my focus, improving access to health through the work that I'm doing. I love the concept, like that's like the first like fundamental thing you can change about yourself as a human to actually have second order, third order effects on how you show up in the world. And so this somehow fits into that mission of health because it's clean water for the world. Like, I can play around with that. And I've done that to myself a lot of times, is like just create these meanings out of things that somehow fit into my vision.
I don't think it's I don't think that's a bad thing, by the way. I still think that's a strength. That's a part of the curiosity and how things fit. I think there's a pressure to have, if you're not doing something that's like directly related to financial or some
Hmm.
form of reward, then it's a waste of time. And so I do think there's something to that. Now, I was thinking when you were talking about that, probably makes sense to do more of a 80/20 breakdown, similar to how Google structures their employee employee work structure, which is it's either 80/20 or 90/10 or even 95/5. But most of the time they're doing their work and then they have a small percentage dedicated to their own passion
Hmm.
project. So that they're still dedicating a significant amount of time to, their key responsibility, but they're
Hmm.
not completely limiting their creativity. And because a lot of the best ideas do come from those at least in my experience, the best ideas come from those micro experiences that you would never have thought of if you hadn't have done that. But you can justify it really, really, really well.
I want to touch on one main topic, sort of the last topic I want to touch on with you, because I think that's a core of like a lot of what you do, at least from the outside, is like getting people together and trying to build that community. So, two questions on this. One is, what is an event or experience where you really felt connected to people as a result of the format or whatever the event was for? And then two, how does one create a very tight knit community?
So there are many events that pop out. I'll just go with one that I created my senior year of college. Basically, it was around 30 different leaders on campus. They were the nonprofit that I was working in beforehand. It was connecting Black and Jewish leaders. So I had a bunch of friends who were in different organizations and clubs, and I reached out to them individually and said, listen, they knew what we were doing, in purpose, where it's like we still have commonality, we're allies, but the differentiator of that event was that we found real artifacts that were culturally aligned. We brought our cultural food, they brought theirs. We all shared stories, dialogue. So that was one event that definitely I felt like very connected to everyone, because it was just, first of all, it felt very safe. I think knowing that the people who are running it have their best interest in mind and really just want them to get to know each other. Like, that's it. That was the sole purpose, for them really just to get to know each other. I think curation of the event and the person who's doing it and everyone knowing the intention behind it so clearly, that makes people feel so much more safe and, are able to open up. And I think in terms of building, I have so many thoughts towards this. I'll try to keep it focused towards building a community. Is the better standard is where you have something where you're just naturally connected with. Like, if you're Indian, it just happens to be, it just helps. It helps because I can't train myself to be Indian. You just are. That helps. That's more of like what you're born into. That's one category. Others are, we're all here for the same purpose and goal. It's so clear why we're all here. It's not just a random event. So if you're all there in San Francisco, I see these all the time, but if you're there because you want to learn, AI technology, and that's what everyone's there for, the event's going to be pretty good, because that's the topic that we all care about. I think the most important out of them all is the quality of people. I would rather have a room of, 15 all great people for what I think would be relevant for that event than 35, with maybe 10 who are great people and 25 who like don't really fit, but they're just there to make the list. I think it's much, much better to have every single person there. This is not scalable, but for a more intimate event, every single person who's there is aligned in mission and goals, and that they're going to be a good fit. Without a doubt. Like, I'm comfortable with this person being here. They're going to make this space comfortable, and they're going to add. Versus, I don't know, but let's just bring them on because that's what we're going to do. I don't think so. I think they all need to be very, very aligned, and you need to be comfortable with every single person.
How do you go about finding these people? Like, are they all people that you know, and they're just referrals from other people that they know? How do you keep it intact, that curation?
I mean, right now, the company that I'm working for, my goal right now is to find, 30 campus ambassadors across different universities who want to build coalitions. How do I do that? So, starting with who I know, first of all, finding Jeff Hyman has a really good book called Recruiting, and he says you need to define the DNA characteristics of the ideal people. So they're not just demographics. Demographics are like easy. You can just do filters and all that stuff. You need to define the DNA characteristics of like who these people really are. And then coming up with really like an ICP model of like who's this exact person, and then identifying people who you think are more likely to know, people or channels who are more likely to know, who would have access to those people. And so that's one channel of doing it. Another is having different events. I mean, people, even in businesses, for word of mouth generation, all that stuff, they have webinars, they have in-person events, they host events, and they invite people who are, you know, in that space. So yeah, I think it's getting extremely clear on who your ideal person is before you reach out to anyone. And then it makes the outreach much easier because you know exactly who you're looking for.
That's super helpful. I have one more question on this because I think it kind of ties into this community aspect. What are your thoughts on mentorship and what role it plays in the growth of someone?
Initially, my initial reaction was to say it's huge. My few
Your
years.
emotional reaction is it's huge, and then your fair and logical reaction.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yes. My breakdown is you do need to be careful with who your mentors are and what their intentions are as well. You need to really trust these people and know that they're either already on a path that you want to go on and they have your best interest in mind. And it needs to be both, I think. They really need to have your best interest in mind. It shouldn't feel transactional. It should feel they should be a good friend really at the end of it or during it. And because some mentors may have really good ideas, but they totally don't know what direction you want to head in. And it could feel like, why are you telling me this stuff? I do think it's really important though. I think our knowledge set is so limited. I think it's another Jewish thought to learn from everyone. Everyone has wisdom. Every single person has wisdom in their experiences. So like a mentor doesn't even have to be someone who's older necessarily. It could be someone who's even younger, but more experienced in something. So I totally buy into learning from people who have different types of wisdom and guidance. But I just be like selective and very careful and really know that this is a good person for me to reach out to and develop a relationship with. I wouldn't just loosely accept a mentor, just like people do mentorship programs all the time. Oh yeah, mentors.
Yeah.
Do they really know who you are and what your interests are? Because advice is very dangerous if it's misguided or it's not in the best interest of that specific person. It could be too broad. It could be a Gary V video, but you're like totally not related to what you're doing now, and it can be really hurtful.
Hmm.
I'm not saying Gary V's advice is bad. I'm just using it as an example. He typically tends to give a lot of advice. So yeah, mentors are important. Be careful with them, but the right ones could be extremely impactful.
Dude, also, last thing on this topic, I found it really hard before to stay in touch with people, keep those relationships going. And something that really flipped for me was just sending them anything that reminds me of them
Right.
at like the most random time. It's like, oh, I saw this random post on LinkedIn or like a research like article that I was reading. I'm like, this topic really, I think this person would like. I just like would send it to 5 people that I think are interested in this topic, and just those very low touch points have been really helpful.
Low touch point, super important. I know one guy he's a venture capitalist that said he goes through every single person on his LinkedIn, every single person, and just says like, how you doing? Happy holidays. Just that's a little bit different because that's everyone, but more for friends. For friends, it's really important to have those small moments. Like if a photo comes up, I'll send it to my friends from like 3 years ago.
Yeah,
No caption, just
the photo. Yeah. I mean, dude, it strikes up conversations. That is, I think, super helpful for someone that finds it hard to stay connected.
right. Yeah, that's definitely a good way to stay connected.
Any parting thoughts on our conversation?
Let's see if we can find the connection points. There's a lot. There's a lot that we talked about. We talked about tennis. Let's do a quick review.
Yeah.
We talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We talked about tennis in relation to business. We talked about nonprofits in relation to for-profits and vice versa. We talked about this is out of order, but auntie and uncle. And
we talked about work and how to show up or how to in events. What are ways to connect with people? What are better ways to connect with people? What are questions you can ask instead of the "How are you doing?" question? We talked about community building and how you found how what are the that you found to be very good as to connect with others, and also how does one do that if they want to?
Right. And then, focusing on deliberately choosing things, having a bunch of interests, dealing with the overabundance of information and feeling productive without being actually that productive, techniques for book learning and note taking. So what are some parallels? Some parallels I'd say are in in the connecting space. I want to take that to tennis. I think in the connecting space, tennis and business, I'll see if I can find three. In the tennis and connecting and business, I think all three, the importance of feedback, even in
Hmm.
conversation. If you can map out how someone responds to the conversation that you're having, like you can have a little bit more of an intuitive sense of like, this is just so flat right now. This is
Yeah,
such a
yeah.
conversation, and that is a data point. That's a point of feedback that you can take, reflect, introspection, engage in introspection, what worked, what didn't work, and then improve for the next time. Same in tennis, very similarly in business. That's A/B testing. In tennis, it's form improvement or losing a game. It's this I guess it's this mentality of taking different types of data points, getting real-time feedback, and seeing what's working, what's not working, and then adjusting based on that if you need to. So that's one area of
That's a huge point. That's a huge point. Another one that came up as you were talking then is how, even when it comes to when it comes to going to events, when it comes to business, when it comes to tennis, if your intention, when it comes to mentorship, if your intention is right, if you have the right and actual natural curiosities towards these things, to the events you go to the community that you want to build, to a sport like tennis, if you're naturally curious about it, not because every other person is going to run club, you're also going to run club, for example. If you're not genuinely curious about the things that you're trying to go for, it is very hard to connect, and make it sustainable. So even when it comes to your business, it's like there has to be some level of connectedness you feel to that problem, similarly to the problem or purpose of an event, similarly to the reason why you're showing up at a tennis club, let's say.
and similar to the purpose that you're trying to have in your life too, the intentionality of, why am I choosing this action? Is this actually aligned with what I'm trying to do longer term? And if it's not, then there's a weird feeling about that. And similarly, when you show up to an event, there's a weird feeling when you're like, you're not into 1980s movies, but you're just there because you're just there, but you didn't really have the right intention. So taking a step back.
Ladies and gentlemen, Blake, bro, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I really like the takeaways. That was really helpful, I think, to get back to that. Because normally I do it by myself, but this real time takeaways with the other person that was right there is so much more better. And I'm actually going to put this, I might do this as on a recurring basis now with everyone.